Hi, I'm David Cronenberg, and I'm watching Crash, and I'm watching some very tricky computer-generated titles that, in fact, were not on the head of the film when it debuted at the Cannes Film Festival, because the credits weren't ready. And in fact, for the entire release in France, which was the first country that the film was released in, these credits were not on any of the prints in France. These have not been seen in France on the screen. The credits were done by a small Toronto company, and it was really their first shot at doing elaborate head credits, and it took them a long time, but they did a fantastic job, and it really sets the film up. The sort of steely, cold look of the metallic letters that are dented. And there's a funny story about these dented letters. In fact, once the letters had been set, the metal of the letters had been set on the computer, when the dents started to be applied, some of the crossbars in the A, for example, would pull out just as though it was actual tubing, metal tubing. And the guys who were doing the credits couldn't figure out how to solve the problem. They went on the internet and looking for an answer, and they ended up talking to a plumber. And the plumber told them that when you do copper tubing like this for plumbing, and you want to prevent cross pieces from pulling out when they get dented, you have to extend the cross piece a couple of inches into the side arms of the A. And this was how they discovered, and this, in other words, they had to work it on the computer as though it was actual plumbing, actual metal tubing. And that's how they solved the problem of the cross pieces pulling out when they dented some of those letters, like those L's right there. A bizarre sort of virtual reality situation, which takes you nicely into the movie itself. The most difficult part of this scene was actually the choreography of the airplanes, figuring out how they should be placed and how much they should overlap each other so that the opening dolly crane shot would work. Everybody wants to know about the sex scenes in the movie. There are a lot of them, and but they were in each case, the sex scenes were the least difficult part of the scenes to work on. It was always the other stuff that was difficult. And here we're introduced to Deborah Unger, who is this is really her first major starring role in a movie, and she caused quite a stir, I have to say, right from the beginning of the first scene. As is usual with me, I always like to look for Canadian actors, just because it's so difficult for Canadian actors to break through, and we felt that we could afford to go with an unknown in that role, and in fact, it might actually be better for us to go with a relative unknown in that role. And I didn't know Deborah's work, but some of her agents were connected with some of the other agents that we'd been working with to cast the film, and she was suggested. I watched Whispers in the Dark, which is a movie with Alan Alda that she had done. And I was impressed with what I saw. And I auditioned her, as well as several other actresses. And it was a very long, it was very intense audition. And she was just so fantastically right for it. And so she was really my discovery for this movie, I felt. And since this time, she's had a couple of other big movies that she's done as a result of playing Catherine in this film. So that pleases me. I hope that nothing would make me feel better than if she became a huge star as a result. And this, of course, is a kind of internal wink at the theme of the movie, which of course involves cars and driving and pieces of cars. The idea here is that the Spader character, who we soon meet, is involved in producing television commercials for car companies, without being too obvious about it, anyway.
please get your stamp of approval on our little...
And this is a very good introduction of Jane Spader, I think. It's probably one of the more interesting introductions of a major character in a recent film.
I'll be there in a minute.
Where were you? The balcony of the Ballards is when we're looking in this direction, is looking over a real balcony at real traffic. But when we're looking in this direction towards the bedroom, it's a set, and matching actual daylight with artificial light, of course, is a very difficult and tricky thing. And there are many scenes like this in the movie, where there are blendings of location shootings and intercutting it with set pieces. And Peter Suschitzky did his usual brilliant job of making them seamless. The actual balcony that we were shooting on was only about 3 feet wide, and the noise that came up from the traffic was unbelievable. You could not actually talk to someone who was standing right next to you. Though all of the dialogue on the balcony had to be dubbed. This is the intersection of the Don Valley Parkway and the 401 highway in Toronto. And it's mesmerizing when you stand on that balcony and watch the cars spin around like a pinball machine. We got roadways to work on in Toronto that had never been shot on before, because they were such a major big deal to shut them down and interfere with the traffic flow in the city. But the city was pretty excited to have a movie that was in fact set in Toronto, and the signs were not changed to look like New York or Chicago signs, and the license plates were left as Ontario license plates. So I think we got a special enthusiastic hand from the Rose Department in Toronto and the surrounding areas. That crash sequence was shot. One car was a remote control car. It's a real car, but controlled by a remote controller that looks just the kind of thing that you would use for a model car, the kind you would buy at some electronics store. It's quite strange to see it driving around with no one in it but a dummy. And the other car was pulled along by cable. So it was a crash between a remote control car and a cable pull car. The timing was slightly off. We had a rehearsal where the timing was dead on, and in this one the timing was slightly off, but it still worked very well. It gave us a lot of angles to use. And then this part of the scene was shot in the interior. It was not shot on the road. The close-ups in that scene. Now, this scene was shot in a real hospital. The hospital beds are very difficult to get if you want to put them into a set. They're very expensive to rent, hard to find. So we did shoot in a real hospital, but we did this sort of glass block wall at the far end was built and inserted there by our production designer, Carol Spear, and her people. And we did shift things around and sort of finesse the color of the bedspreads and so on, so that it's almost a set, even though it's in an actual hospital.
The other man, the dead man, his wife's a doctor.
There are a lot of scars and bruises in this movie, and they're brilliantly done by our makeup people, Stéphane Dupuis in particular, whose responsibility for this kind of makeup was his. And later the scarring, which is so difficult to do, and there are a couple of characters who walk around with a lot of scars through the whole movie. It's so difficult to make them look real. and so that you don't have to worry about lighting them all the time. And Stefan really managed to do that. It was really quite artful and subtle. We studied a lot of car crashes and came up with a few interesting details. The fact that very often the seat belt will give you a cut along the side of your neck, for example. But despite the fact that this movie caused a huge furor in just about every country it played in, I still maintain that I was very restrained in making it, certainly compared with the realities of car crashes. And as I will discuss later, even in terms of the sexuality, I think the movie is really quite restrained. So it obviously was pushing some buttons that were very deeply embedded and rarely pushed, I think, is really what was happening. I think a lot of people end up thinking the film is very violent when in fact it's really not violent at all, but it's conceptually violent. It does violence to people's concepts of what is proper and acceptable and conceivable even. And I think that's really why it got the reaction it did, because I think frame by frame there's nothing really particularly gory or grotesque or it's really in the flow of the thing and the organic life of it that it is disturbing, and that then is ideal. I mean, it's the conceptual level that it works on most strongly, and that to me that's perfect.
James Ballard.
Here we're introduced to Vaughn, and Vaughn is a man who is very scarred, and even as we meet him, and the scarring on his face is particularly well done. I think it's very subtle and yet very powerful. Of course, James will have his own scars after this accident, as does Holly Hunter. This was the first day shooting, this scene in the corridor of the hospital, and it was a bit of a nightmare for me. It was one of the first times in my life that I hadn't actually been to the location that I was going to shoot at for various reasons. It just kind of slipped through the cracks, and I saw it on tape and in photos. And when I got there, of course, for me it's always the 3D, the plasticity of it, the space that counts, and it was not what I thought. So I had a very rough couple of days working in this place trying to make it work, and a lot of cheating of angles and making the corridors longer than they actually were by what they call a French reverse, which is to say that when you're shooting in one direction, you move to one end of the corridor to look down the entire corridor. And then when you reverse and shoot in the other direction to look at the other person speaking, you move down to the other end of the corridor. So it makes the corridor look twice as long as it actually was.
Like little streamers of black lace running towards the windshield wiper gutters. Honeyed flecks were spattered across the seat and steering wheel. And the instrument panel was buckled inwards, cracking the clock and
There was much discussion in the scene about what Deborah Unger would be holding on to in this scene, and we did end up with a very lifelike kind of dildo that James Spader wanted to wear, which he did. And I have to admit, it worked better than without. We tried it both ways. This is definitely the using the dildo takes that you see in this movie here. This is also the beginning of what I think is perhaps begun by the exposing of Holly Hunter's breast just after the car crash, which is the connection between sexuality and car crashes, and how the changes in the body begin to affect the sexuality of all the people involved in the film. How the car crash and the transforming or transmutation of one's body becomes your entree into this kind of informal underground of people whose sexuality has been changed by their car crashes.
I feel too close to her.
this particular shot that we're looking at now was actually shot on a set, because the original shot that I did, I had Spader wearing a leg brace, and I was not very happy with the effect. It was very cold and kind of uninteresting. It's the same leg brace that we will see later, kind of a stretchy, velcroed kind of modern thing. So we went back and shot this version of it instead, where you see his leg naked and bruised and scabbed and so on. And it's much more effective. The whole scene is much more effective as a result. And once again, Peter Sushitsky had to match something that we had shot in daylight and live on a set. I was very excited when I found this underground garage that allowed you to look out onto an active roadway at sort of eye level. It was perfect, and in fact, I posed in front of this particular spot for the cover of a book, and then it's a shot that looks just like that, except that I'm leaning against that railing, that Armco barrier. We created this sort of crashed car pound under the intersection of a couple of the roads that we, in fact, shoot on top of. But it's actually very typical of some pound. My car was towed recently, and I was parking in a tow zone, and it was taken to a place that looked exactly like this, even though I thought I was inventing it completely. But as it turned out, it's very common to have a kind of impounding structure of either for crashed cars or for cars that have been towed or for stolen cars. Or I wouldn't be surprised to see a used car lot under there sometime. 1983 is not significant in terms of year. It just happens to be the number that was on the car. They would put a number on each car so they could identify it. And later some people wanted to know what the significance of 1983 was. I guess it's because it's 1 year before 1984, but really I hadn't noticed it. I hadn't thought of it as a year until it was pointed out to me. Of course, this is the first and very strange meeting of the two who have crashed into each other since they saw each other briefly at the hospital. And they begin to speak to each other, of course, out of the strange bond that they have, that they barely understand themselves. It was a really interesting scene to play.
After this sort of thing, how do people manage to look at a car, let alone drive one?
A lot of people's driving habits changed after they made this movie, the people involved in the film. Holly, for example, got rid of her pickup truck, or she had never driven anything but a pickup truck until she saw the crash footage that we had, and then she got her first car, a BMW 850. Because the pickup trucks didn't really fare that well in a lot of the crash tests that we saw, and it's really quite scary, a lot of this stuff. I'd deliberately given James, the James Ballard character, a rather boring car. It's really a Dodge Dynasty, but we put our own symbol on it, just because of after the crash scene, you see a mysterious close-up of the hand of the man who has crashed, has flown through the windshield of the car and lies dangling on the hood with his hand down, and you see the imprint of the car emblem on his palm. Some people don't notice that the first time through, but it's just really the beginning of sort of a whole structure, a kind of internal mythology built. There's the symbol right there that we invented, Although it looks pretty good. I mean, I expect to see a car any day now come up with that as its sort of symbol logo, um, and just the beginning of a kind of internal mythology within the film of the imprinting on the human body by the metallic objects and pieces and parts of vehicles. I wanted James to have a fairly boring car because, if you had a Ferrari or if you had some supercar, it would, I think, would diminish the concept that the film is really discussing, which is that technology at its most boring, at its least noticeable, is in fact the most potent technology. I mean, the car embodies all of the technology that we have at our disposal right now, including computer technology. And yet it's almost invisible. The guy who jumps into his car in the morning, drives to work, doesn't think twice about it, is the ultimate man-machine interface, not, as was suggested on the cover of Wired magazine, a Formula One driver like the Canadian Jacques Villeneuve. Someone like Jacques this is quite a brilliant driver driving the highest of high-tech formula cars. To me, that's not the ultimate man-machine interface. It's this man right here who's driving to work or driving around the city without even thinking twice about it. He's completely fused his own nervous system, his own physiology with the reality of the car. I mean, he just takes it for granted that he can do this, that he can travel that fast, that he can compress time and space by jumping into a car.
Seemed to be
the first actor into this film actually was Holly Hunter. Before I'd actually sent the script out to any actors that I knew of, I got a phone call from Holly's agent saying that Holly wanted to play Helen Remington and had read the script. And I said, well, how'd you get the script? Of course, my agents had the script. Once some agent gets the script, everybody gets the script. But that was actually very exciting news because, of course, anticipating going out to actors with this movie, I was worried that once again I would be rejected as I had been on many of my other movies, just because the material was so intense and strange and sexual in this case. And in fact, once Holly's in, once you have your first main actor in the movie, that's kind of like the central crystal of the film, and everything starts to work around that. Not that Spader, however, needed to know about Holly to make him excited about the film. I actually phoned him and we began to talk. And he did ask me who I was going to cast, because he said, after all, I get to fuck everybody in this movie, don't I? And once he said that, I knew I had the right guy. I knew he wasn't going to be afraid or intimidated, and that, in fact, that's exactly how he was on the set. I mean, he was completely unafraid and unintimidated. This is really a brilliant music cue for this whole sequence of Howard Shore's. He somehow is able to just get right inside the innards of a scene on some subliminal level that's almost beyond articulation, and just amplify it and add to it and extend it. It's really fantastic, and I love this cue in particular. We were all very determined in the movie, the cast and I, to make the sexuality as real and as awkward and as strange as it would be under these circumstances, and to not try to make it more graceful or more cinematic in the traditional way, so it's fumbly and awkward. One of the things that this movie does is it offers sort of sequential sex scenes, 2 or 3 in a row, which is something that drives a lot of people mad. They can't understand it, they can't deal with it. They think it must mean that the film is pornography. Someone once wrote somewhere that a series of sex scenes is not a plot. This was someone who had seen the film in a sort of a test screening. And my answer was, well, why not? Why can't it be? And here you see the perfect example. The Holly and Spader characters have sort of orgasmic, instantaneous, strange sex because they've had a crash together. And then here, working towards the same orgasm with his wife, it doesn't work out at all because his wife has not had her crash yet, even though she's sitting on his lap in the same position and so on, and they're trying to kind of recapture the moment that he had in the airport parking garage with Holly. It's not working because she hasn't had her crash yet. So if you have to notice what's happening in that scene and not just sort of turn off and watch it as a kind of a titillating scene and that's it. It has meaning, and in this movie, whether someone has an orgasm or doesn't is extremely significant and has implications and consequences.
Piloted his Porsche 550 Spider race car toward a date with death. Along a lonely stretch of California, 2-lane blacktop, Route 466. Don't worry, that guy's gotta see us.
Now this is a scene that is not exactly in the book, J.G. Ballard's book. In the book there are sort of artificially created car crashes that spectators come to watch, but certainly famous car crashes like the James Dean crash and the Jane Mansfield crash and so on are mentioned in the book. I kind of combined them and had sort of a spectacle, being a small sort of underground subversive car crash spectacle. Created by the Vaughn character, in which he tries to recreate the James Dean crash. This gave me a chance to play with a car that was more interesting than the Dodge Dynasty. In this case, it's a replica of the Porsche 550 Spider that James Dean actually drove when he crashed. It was actually a race car. It was never a road car, but in those days, in the mid-50s, a lot of the racing cars were legal for the street and were just they were very closely connected with the street models. If we had a real Porsche 550 Spider from the mid-50s, it would have been worth $2 or $3 million. Needless to say, we didn't have that to spend on a crash in a movie that cost a total of $9 million. So we did with this what is called the Beck replica. It's really quite a good replica of the car, but it's fiberglass. It's not aluminum, which the original car would have been.
I myself shall play the role of James Dean's racing mechanic, Rolf Wudrich, sent over from the Porsche factory in Zuffenhausen, Germany.
And everything that Vaughn is saying in this scene about the James Dean crash is quite accurate. And there are, in fact, people who are quite obsessed with the James Dean crash and who go on pilgrimages every year at the time of year that Dean crashed and follow his route north to Salinas, and they eat the apple that he is said to have eaten at the gas station or whatever the details are. They go through the whole ritual. For all I know, they wear those red windbreakers too. I'm not sure. So as exaggerated as this scene is in some ways, it's really no more intense than what's really out there for some people.
Salinas was just a dusty town in Northern California.
One of the things that was a lot of people's favorite thing in the book was a whole element that involved the actress Elizabeth Taylor. Vaughn was obsessed with Elizabeth Taylor, and one of his desires was to die in a car crash with her. And the reason that I didn't use that in the movie at all, there are several specific reasons. One is that even Elizabeth Taylor is no longer Elizabeth Taylor. I mean, a lot of the people who would see this movie will have no idea who Elizabeth Taylor is. I mean, she's just a matronly lady who raises money for AIDS. She has managed, and that it's wonderful for her, to gracefully age, but that's why I preferred to use the James Dean Hollywood connection, because by dying young, as is mentioned in the movie, he died of a broken neck and became immortal. It seems to be the only way that you can become immortal is to die young in some flamboyant way and in public. And so I felt that he was to use the James Dean crash as the Hollywood iconic connection was more apropos than to use Elizabeth Taylor. If you look carefully in this shot, you can see me and some of the other crew in the darkness, although we look like spectators who have come out of the woods, but we're there in our down parkas. This Porsche replica was controlled, was a remote controlled car as well. You take out you put this remote control unit in, it controls the steering and the throttle and the brakes and so on, with two dummies. So for the actual moment of impact, it's actually two dummies in the car. The day before, this night we were supposed to shoot this, I noticed the special effects guys running the car up and down the road, driverless, completely driverless, and I thought to myself, in fact said to my gaffer, Scotty Allen, who's worked on a lot of my movies, I said, I think they're going to crash that car. And sure enough, they flipped it into a ditch when, of course, no cameras were running. And we had to kind of mock up a windshield. I mean, it was looking like it could be a disaster, but I had to laugh. I just laughed, which is my way of dealing with something like that. And in fact, they expected me to beat them and fire them. And in fact, they were very good boys after that. And we got everything we needed from the scene. But it did look like it could be a disaster. Of course, we only had one of those cars. And we didn't know how badly it had been hurt by being flipped totally on its head in the ditch. Everything in this movie was shot within about 10 minutes from our production offices in Toronto, which was down by the lakeshore. And it's a part of town I particularly enjoy shooting in. And haven't done it for quite a few years. I mean, the last 5 movies I've done have been more and more studio pictures in the sense that they've been in interiors in sets and very little shooting on the streets. And this movie, there was sort of a reversion to what I had done all the time in Scanners and Videodrome, which is to say, shooting very much in locations on the streets of the city. And it was kind of interesting for me to go back to that kind of shooting. It's much less controlled, and you're much more at the mercy of the weather, but you also get surprises and textures and buildings and locations and things that you can never quite get in a set. And for Howard Shore too, it was a return to a kind of composing and music recording that he hadn't done since Scanners and Videodrome. He also had sort of gotten into his version of studio work, which is to say, we almost always went to London and recorded with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, maybe 80, 90-piece orchestra. And in this movie, he came back to Toronto to record, I think, for the first time since The Brood, probably. And really with very few instruments, 6 electric guitars the first day, next day 3 harps, the next day 2 percussionists, and then layer all the music and mix it all together, rather than having sort of the 80 pieces right there in front of you. So it was very interesting for us to return to this way of movie making. It feels much more like guerrilla filmmaking. And although a lot of people have told me this movie feels completely controlled, very controlled, and I suppose it is, I work in a very spontaneous way. There's very little planned. I don't use storyboards, and I really like to work with the actors on the real location to choreograph a scene like this, for example.
It seemed to go perfectly, but then we started to feel nauseous on the way back. I'm sure it's concussion.
So this is really the James Ballard character's introduction into the world of the Seagraves, their strange little family that they've kind of developed. Some people talk about it as a cult, but I mean, they don't have the status of a cult. They're not organized enough. And Vaughn is not really a cult leader. He's not even a guru, because he also is fumbling his way to some understanding and meaning. He's not someone who feels that he has all the answers and he is now imparting it and leading everyone to some final conclusion about life and how they should live their lives. One of the things that Spader said to me about the movie when we had our first telephone conversation was that he was fascinated by the movie and terrified as well. And in truth, to play these roles is quite a challenge for an actor because there are not the old tricks that you can fall back on here. The way the characters work, their psychology, their lack of any past or any past psychology. There is no past history to these characters. In fact, when we meet them, they're already in some kind of strange limbo where their past is almost irrelevant. They don't have children. They don't have parents. They don't refer to their past at all. And this is part of what makes the book work, and it's part of what makes the movie work in the strange way that it does, that gives it that strange futuristic or disconnected quality. But it is very difficult for an actor to play because an actor cannot play concepts. An actor has to play the character, has to play the role, has to play the scene. It's very plastic and sculptural and physical for an actor. And you end up having to look for actors who are unafraid or are not afraid, at least, to be afraid, as Spader was not afraid to be afraid. That was part of the attraction for him. And I think all the actors in this movie approached it that way. The fear was the good part. And here Ballard is informally being allowed into the inner sanctum. That's just to say, Vaughn's study as part of the Seagraves house. He's still remaining a little aloof, a little cynical, but not for long. This shot actually took a long time to do, this one we're looking at now. The movement of the foreground and the background, it actually drove me and my camera people and the dolly grip and the lighting guys crazy. And it feels like such a simple shot. You don't think of it twice, but just the way they're drifting and to make sure that they're not blocking each other in a way that doesn't work, and just the pulling of focus and everything. And I look at it now, it looks totally simple and inevitable, but it took hours and hours and hours to get this shot to work, just moving people around.
You recognize her? That's Gabrielle. You saw right outside the door there.
These are some of my favorite moments in the movie with Vaughn, where he begins to inhale James Ballard like an animal. That's a really wonderful moment here. Vaughn is played by Elias Koteas, who is a wonderful Canadian actor who's been in a lot of American films, but he's also been in a couple of Adam Egoyan's films, The Adjuster and Exotica in particular. He was in Tucker and quite a few other American films. Here we're introduced to the character Gabrielle, played by Rosanna Arquette. This character was the center of a major controversy in England, which went completely insane over this film, delayed the release of the film for over a year, as newspapers screamed for it to be banned and for me to be put in jail and all kinds of really quite strange things. And at one point, one of the journalists talked about having sex with cripples. There's a scene that comes later with Rosanna and Spader, and how disgusting that was. And of course, suddenly, the disabled of England rose up as one to condemn this guy. It really quite backfired on him because, of course, they said, "Well, wait a minute, we're disabled, but does that mean we can't have sex? I mean, what if you've been married for 20 years and your husband is crippled in a car crash? Does that mean it's disgusting for you to have sex with him?" And so on and so on. So the Gabrielle character became somehow politically correct. I accidentally had made a politically correct film, and she became the emblem of the disabled who were not to be intimidated by their own injuries and so on, and were quite aggressively and proudly sexual in with their whatever bodies they now had in the new shape and form that they had. So it's quite a strange reversal. It's just one of many that this film has sort of induced in its time.
Because I'm not going to hold a sense.
These scenes were shot actually in our production offices, and this is actually looking out the window of our production offices. We did put the crane there, but it was sort of found art because there is a sort of a camera company. I think Panavision has its offices there, or did, and I really saw that crane outside the window a day or two earlier, and said we should have that in the shot. We should, because he's making commercials, and just to keep that connection going without making a big deal out of it, and to give that shot just some other element of machininess that it didn't quite have. There had been a big boat parked out there, which I really wanted to get into that shot as well through the window, but it was taken away before we actually got to shoot. Here's where we really start to feel the presence of Vaughn's car, although we've sort of seen it, the interior of it, and a shot of it driving up to the Seagraves before, but here it starts to take on its sort of mythic position in the film as a creature, as an embodiment of Vaughn, and as a threatening sexual beast, about to eat the rump of that little Miata. We painted the Miata silver because in the book her car is white. It's not specified what car it is. It's a little sports car, they say. And of course the book was written in 1973 or published in 1973, so it would have been a different car entirely. We painted it silver because for a cinematographer, a white car at night is a major problem because it reflects too much light, and you're either exposing it or underexposing everything else. So the compromise was to make it silver, which worked for me fine, and for Peter as well. Where the camera goes on the cars in this movie is a major concept that I had to deal with all the time, because I wanted the relationship of the people in their cars to be special and unusual, without being arch and cute and doing huge arcing dolly shots over the car or whatever. But where to put the camera on the car was a major issue for me at every moment, as was where to put the camera in the sex scenes, because there are probably no more photographed things in movies than sex and cars. Actually, I think you know that you're not going to come up with a way of looking at it that's totally unique in one shot that's never been done before by anyone. So it's a matter of the accumulation of the way the film works visually. In this scene, although it's really relatively simple visually, it's sort of a combination of the lighting, the body position, the choreography, and of course the dialogue. And it's really the dialogue that got this movie, this scene, banned in Ireland, for example. It was the words in this scene that made them crazy, not the physical action going on. And I still haven't at this moment decided whether to let the movie play there without the scene or not. I think not, really.
Have you seen his penis?
I think it's badly scarred. From a motorcycle accident.
Is he circumcised? Can you imagine what his anus looks like? Describe it to me.
This dialogue is taken pretty much verbatim from the book. There's no sexy talk in the usual way in the book. It's all very medical and clinical, and that gives it its further strangeness. It's a kind of a medical textbook sex. It's really quite odd, the feeling of it in the book, and I think we maybe lit this more sensually and more sort of classically sexy than there is anything in the book, really. But I felt that I had to constantly balance those elements in the film between what was repulsive, what was off-putting, and what was seductive. I wanted the film to be seductive, but in a strange and kind of difficult way, not an easy way. And so in each scene, I'm kind of playing with seduction and repulsion. In this scene, really, James and Catherine are invoking Vaughn in order to make sex between them possible. They really can't do it alone. And so they are verbally invoking Vaughn here, which makes sex possible for them. And then, of course, later they will physically and actually invoke Vaughn and involve him in their sexuality. So this is the beginning, the anticipation of that. There's a lot of discussion about this movie and anal sex and the fact that the characters are rarely facing each other while they're having sex and so on. And it was not a conscious thing in my case, but while with the actors choreographing the scenes, the feeling that the actors were not looking at each other, that in fact that there's an avoidance of direct contact, that's I think really the reason that the sex scenes have been choreographed the way they are. And of course you're working with your actors as well, and their intuitions have a lot to do with the way the scenes are played as well. And in all the sex scenes, well, actually in all the scenes, I had monitors that the actors could look at any time to see what they just shot. A lot of directors don't like to do that. They don't like to give the actors access to monitors because they feel it distracts them and they want to keep looking at their takes and not work. But I don't feel that way. I feel that being quite open and collaborative about it is the best way. And in fact, the actors were completely relaxed about all the sex scenes in terms of they knew what they knew what it looked like. They knew what was going on. They could make adjustments in terms of, we were really basically saying, how does the scene work best? How do we make it look the right way? And now we see that the Spader character is no longer obsessed. He has to move on from the woman that he had the crash with. The sex isn't working here for him either, whereas the sex is now working with his wife, but only if Vaughn is involved. And so we can see that this is the beginning of the end of the sexual relationship between the Spader character and Holly Hunter's character, and that they are all going to have to move to some other place, which is leading them further and further to some other place, which we are not sure of, and of course they're not sure of either. I love this. This is a Seagraves at Home. I think there should be a TV series, The Seagraves, watching crash footage as though it were some kind of porno tape. And the Swedish voiceover, of course Swedish because of the Volvo safety campaign, which I wrote. He's actually talking about how actual corpses are sometimes used in crashes in order to really assess the damage that can be done in a crash. And that's actually quite true. It's not well known because it's such a grotesque idea. But in fact, crash test dummies cannot give you all the information you want. They're just not complex enough. So the corpses are used at times in crash testing. There are definitely overtones in this movie, and in particularly perhaps in this scene of some of my earlier films. It's intuitive on my part. It's absolutely not conscious. I'm not trying to return to my roots or anything like that. It's just there are those strange characters and those strange creatures who exist at the margins of society, and I am interested in that because I suppose I identify with them in some way. And if you're a card-carrying existentialist, which I tend to think that I am, you feel that all of these things are, in fact, efforts of human will, that normality is just an effort of human will, a conceptual thing, rather than anything that is exists in nature, for example, as an absolute. So these people are all embarked on a voyage of which involves not just reinventing themselves, but reinventing their whole understanding of society and physicality, physiology, sexuality, everything else. The Seagraves, you've got to love them. This next shot, well, there are two shots that are coming up that are amongst my favorites in the movies in terms of just single shots. This one and the next one. And, of course, their juxtaposition is particularly enhances both of them. I made a still out of this shot to be used in some booklets that we had at Cannes. And, of course, this car, the Lincoln Continental, we actually had 6 of them. We cut one of them in half so that we could do some shooting in the front seat and the back seat that you couldn't really get angles at unless you did cut the car in half. We made a pickup truck out of one of them in the sense that we took the back seats out and put a platform for generators and lights. And of course, a couple of them were crashed. And we all became rather fond of them. They really did embody the 60s so well. An era that is really, really gone for good. This monstrous car. This sort of 5,000-pound car with a huge motor and skinny tires, and you could really spin the wheels very easily. There's a lot of fun to drive, but I wouldn't think it would be fun to drive in the wet, for example. And our stuntmen were amazing with these cars. They just threw them around like they were go-karts. Really fantastic. You couldn't miss with shooting this car either. I mean, it's just any angle on that car looked amazing. When we started to research famous car crashes, it's really quite frightening how many famous people of all kinds, from Albert Camus to Nathaniel West to you name it, have died in car crashes. Really, it's a huge, huge list. Which grows every day.
For example, the car crash is a fertilizing rather than a destructive event. A liberation of sexual energy, mediating the sexuality of those who have died with an intensity that's impossible in any other form.
There are still a lot of people who think that the book Crash is a science fiction book, even those who have read it. And yet when you read it, there's really nothing that, by normal standards, could be considered sci-fi. It's very much rooted in the 70s in which it was written. And yet there is something that feels futuristic about it. And I think my understanding of that was that it was the psychology of the people, that kind of disaffected, disconnected psychology. Someone described the dialogue as narcotized, which I kind of like. And I think it is. It's a kind of disaffected, not really drugged in the normal sense, but it is the psychology of the future, I think, that Ballard is playing with. He's thinking that if these tendencies that we have, that we can see right now, become more and more prevalent, then this will become the standard, the normal psychology in the future, what now might seem aberrant or abnormal in some way. So that's also, I think, in the movie, is really the only what you would call sci-fi element. But it is so strong, and it is so much a part of the tone of the movie, the look of the movie, the rhythm of the movie, that there is a sense, I suppose, in which you could think of Crash as sci-fi in some strange way. A lot of these shots, including the ones we're looking at now, were done on a trailer, really. It's a very low-rise trailer so that you can pull the car and put lights on around the car and even dolly around the car. We use that dolly a lot. We use the sort of the camera car pulling the trailer. There was a lot of trickery involved in getting a lot of these shots. Now here you see a perfect example of that. We are dollying along the car as we pan. Here, the camera is moving along the trailer so the camera crew is actually on the trailer with the car, and so is a lot of the lights. I am sitting in the back of the tow truck, watching everything on a monitor as well as watching it live. A lot of the scenes that we shot in, we were completely at the mercy of the ambient light. We added our own lighting, of course, to blend in with it, but there was no way that we could light 5 or 6 miles of road the way you could in a big budget movie. So we actually, some of the times I was choosing the roads because of the kind of lighting that they had at night. Was it mercury vapor or sodium vapor or what kind of lights they were? And then we would integrate our own lights that were on our camera car with them to give it a very real, but still a very controlled look that had meaning and coherence with the rest of the film. Of course, we were not looking for a documentary look at all. This is much too stylized for that. But still, a shot like this is very real and very strange. And of course, a lot of people who drove by the other way were quite, a lot of them almost drove off the road. They couldn't quite understand what was going on. A scene like this, which looks so intimate, in fact, we had a police escort. We had police on Harleys, and we had police cars in front of us and behind us, and we had all our guys at every intersection making sure that cars wouldn't come across. So the intimacy, of course, is a complete illusion as well. This is also shot right from our production offices. I think this was the Carol Spears office, the production designer's office. Really quite a difficult time color correcting. She was so cold. And of course for Vaughn, who eventually takes off his jacket and his shirt, it was also a complete nightmare. It's also very difficult to get scars, fake scars that are glued on to work properly in the cold. It was just incredibly bitter. You can see the breath there. And you can feel it. I mean, just even in the way it's lit. You can almost feel the metal creaking in the cold, contracting. It's really, but it added something to the scene, I must say. Just look at that car, it looks cold. This is the first really scene that we see Vaughn's having any kind of vulnerability or weakness at all.
Why don't I drive?
And still he turns it into a kind of seductive strength at the end of the scene.